All right. Well, welcome to another episode of the Rest and Recovery podcast. I have the honor to have Natalie Niddam. I think I just hacked up her name, even though she told me how to pronounce it. And she's a self-proclaimed science geek with a passion for human health, a litany of certifications and experience, and a coach. So, Natalie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to meet you, Scott.
Yes,
I've heard a lot of great things about you.
Yeah, well, I will have to pay off whoever told us. I know who that is. So, thank you so much. Yeah, it's fun to get connected with common friends and connections to talk more about wellness. It's for me a journey for the last 2+ years, probably longer, but I mean, really for me in starting this podcast and going down rabbit holes as we kind of talked offline. And you're in an area that is definitely newer to me, but seems to be kind of on the forefront of health and fitness, or not fitness, but wellness. So just maybe before we get started, a little bit about you and your practice. I gave the brief introduction, but I'm not going to do that justice.
Sure. So my practice is it's really just one, at this point, it's one leg of my overall business, if you will.
Okay.
I started off as a holistic nutritionist, and I then went on to become a human potential coach way back in the day. And from there, my next fascination was with epigenetics and genetics. So I became certified as an Apeiron Epigenetic Coach. And so, I think, and as we were talking earlier in the business that we're in, it is a journey. And along the way, you come across all of this really interesting stuff. And the challenge for all of us, I think, is where do we stop and dig in, and where do we give a nod and say, keep moving, just nothing to see here, or take a little bit, but just keep moving forward. And for me, I thought I was pretty much there with the epigenetics and the human potential coaching and the nutrition. And what happened was I went to a conference and went to a lecture, which, I don't know, we've never met before, but whenever I go to these conferences, I spend more time in the exhibit hall than I do in any session generally. But at this particular conference, I ended up going to this one session that literally blew my mind. And it was actually Dan Stickler, who heads up Apeiron, who was doing a talk on these things called peptides, which I personally had never heard of before. And so I think about 20 minutes in, my jaw was on the floor, and I'm like poking the person's shoulder in front of me going, is he kidding? And he's like, no, he's not kidding. And I'm like, come on, shut up. Like, get out of here.
Yeah. Too good to be true.
There's no way that anything can do this stuff. Right. And so I left the conference and quasi obsessed with this whole thing. And I came home, and I'm like telling my husband, who's generally his eyes kind of glaze over, but he's listening to me, and he kind of goes, and he could tell that this could be a problem, because this could be another course,
open up another box,
a whole other box. Right. Yeah. And he's like, you know what, Nat, you stop it. Like, you've got shiny object syndrome. And I have since redefined shiny object syndrome as I am a lifelong learner. And
there you go.
If you're going to be on this journey with me, then you're going to get with the program and figure out that, it's really just as we curate information for our clients as coaches in this broader space, we also have to curate what's coming into us from the world and be able to identify, like, what are the things that are worthy of further investigation. So anyway, long story short, I ended up starting a Facebook group because I was so fascinated with these peptides that I had to figure out a way to spend more time on them. And that community is now almost 10,000 people. And this is maybe a little over 2.5 years in. And wow. I think it would be bigger, except that the Facebook algorithm, as I'm sure you know, is not super friendly to those of us offering alternative solutions to people. So it's been somewhat shorten. But the other thing that I did is I started a podcast, and that was, again, with the ulterior motive of getting people who knew about peptides to talk to me so that I could learn more about them. And I did, I did a certification course and this, that, and the other thing. And so here we are today. I've now kind of woven this whole idea of peptide therapies and bioregulators within the context of being a health coach, so I'm not a doctor. There's definitely lanes you've got to watch on peptides because they're incredibly powerful. But it's definitely an area that I think has already, for many people, changed the way they practice medicine, certainly in the more functional space.
Okay.
And now we're even seeing it in the mainstream. Like there's a peptide that's just hit the mainstream that has completely and will revolutionize fat loss and type 2 diabetes treatments.
Wow, really? That's, as we know from the past 2 years, those two are the two prominent, well, for any morbidity, but most recently, the top two.
Yeah, I was actually saying to my husband the other day in one of my many rants, because I rant a lot, and just saying to him, the governments should be actually funding this, right? If to stop this thing from decimating people, we need to help the people who are suffering from obesity and type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
And this compound, which is, frankly, if you don't have insurance, it's unaffordable because it's new and it was developed by a pharmaceutical company, and legitimately, these guys seek to make their money back. Big time. But frankly, this should almost be, you want to put fluoride in water, put this stuff in the water.
Yeah, it'd be a heck of a lot better than fluoride. That's a whole nother rabbit hole.
I think so.
That's a whole nother rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So there's so many pathways I want to go down, but maybe let's start kind of at the ground level, especially for me and those listening, like peptides 101. What exactly is it? And you mentioned it's produced by a pharmaceutical company, but how is it different?
Right. So peptides by definition are small proteins, right? Okay. And so depending on who you talk to, it's either a maximum of 50 amino acids or 100 amino acid chain. So they're small proteins. They are signaling molecules in the body, and they are often fragments or modified fragments of naturally occurring proteins in the body that act as signaling molecules. So I'll give you a couple of examples, right? We'll leave the shiny object for later. But for example, one of the most well-known peptides it goes by BPC 157. And BPC stands for Body Protective Compound 157.
Okay.
So Body Protective Compound 157, and 157 is, I think it's 1 to number 57. So it's the 57 amino acids. And I could be wrong about that, or it could be 15 to 7. It basically, if there's a number involved, it usually refers to a sequence in the amino acid chain of the original compound that this was isolated from.
Okay, so it's kind of like taking a string and then like clipping it.
Like you chop out a chunk of it. Exactly.
Okay.
BPC 157 is naturally occurring in the human gut.
Okay.
And it has receptors all over the body. Like your whole body has receptors. It is a very, very powerful signaling molecule. It is one of the most powerful healing peptides that we have currently in the arsenal. It is magic for healing anything going on with the gut. So everything from in the mouth, leaky gut, IBS, IBD, Crohn's, colitis. But
that kind of ground zero to pretty much health, from my understanding too, like 70% of your lymph, your immune, all that kind of stuff is all in the gut.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But beyond that, it is also a signaling molecule for healing of soft tissues. So musculoskeletal injuries, so ligaments, tendons, muscles, all tissues. It also can help. I've seen it written in as part of protocols to deal with kidney disease because it's critical for kidneys, for heart. So in animal studies, so now most of the studies that are published on BPC 157 are still animal studies. But in the animal studies, you will see studies where it normalizes blood pressure in rats where they have induced high blood pressure. And the word is normalize. It doesn't lower it. It doesn't raise it. It normalizes it.
What's the difference there?
Well, so, and it's funny because it's a little bit like people are always talking about, well, I need something to boost my immune system. Well, the truth of the body is you don't want to boost anything mindlessly because you could get yourself into a heap of trouble, right? When we take drugs for blood pressure, they are either blood pressure lowering drugs or blood pressure boosting. They're going to raise your blood pressure because it's too low.
Okay.
There's an inherent problem there because you need to then be monitoring your blood pressure so that you don't go too low and you don't go too high. With BPC 157, it normalizes blood pressure. So somehow it enables the systems in the body to come back online that regulate blood pressure.
Wow. That's
right?
amazing. Yeah.
So it's not, and I'm not getting, and I will say to you that it's not like somebody who's listening to this podcast who has high blood pressure today can run out by BPC 157 and it's going to solve their problems.
Right.
One of the big mistakes people make with peptides is they think they're going to take the peptide, and it's just going to solve their whole problem.
Sure.
We know that the body is super complex. We know that every issue that we are dealing with, whether it's high blood pressure or gut issues or whatever the case may be, is also complex. It can have many different, I wanted to say in French, raison d'être. It has many different sources and drivers that are driving that issue. So you have to, while you're bringing this peptide on board, which is a very powerful and elegant way of addressing a problem, you also have to have identified the drivers and be doing all the other things you need to be doing as well. But what the BPC 157 or whatever the other peptide is going to do for you is it kind of gives you this leg up where it re-engages the body's systems to do the healing.
Okay. So
right?
almost like a catalyst to remind it what to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's got these receptors. So it'll bind to a receptor, which will initiate a cascade of events at the cellular level so that, you get healing of musculoskeletal injuries. Or, what'll sometimes happen with BPC is somebody will take it because they're having gut issues. Like it can be really good for people with ulcers or with GERD, with heartburn.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been shown in some studies to help to recondition that the flap that is supposed to sit right.
Yeah.
Which can be a problem for people, but you have to get at the issue.
Yeah.
Right. But then somebody will be taking this BPC 157 for a gut issue. This is what I was driving at. And then they'll come back to you like 3 weeks or a month later and go, it's the funniest thing. Like I've had this back problem for the longest time, or I've had pain in my knee for the longest time. And it seems to have gone away. Is that possible? And the truth is yes. And so it is not, it's not specific. It is right. Going to signal the body wherever. Now, whether you're taking enough to address all the things you have to address, the body has its own hierarchy of needs that it's going to deal with.
Right.
But we do see that happening as well. Or they'll take it for their knee and they'll say, wow, but my gut's gotten so much better.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, like you said, it's not specific, but I think there's a great theme in medicine in general as we get more personalized. At the end of the day, you still have to know yourself and like how you're going to respond to things, because this outside solution might be great, but maybe not optimal for you. You hear, and that goes for probably just about anything, whether it's taking vitamins or whatever. Like I can take a bunch of multivitamins, but if I'm high in iron and it's got a bunch of iron in it, that might not be optimal for me or whatever. Absolutely. Fill in the blank.
I absolutely agree. And with BPC, it is the, I call it the Model T Ford of the peptide world, because it kind of seems to hit so many different things. But the truth of BPC 157, as much as it's also really good for the brain, it's good for TBIs, it's good for, it seems to balance the dopaminergic, serotonergic, and GABAergic systems in the brain.
Okay.
And yet there's a small percentage of people who don't tolerate it. There's a small percentage of people, it makes them nutty or drives anxiety or they can't sleep. So, and when I first started, And this doesn't go back that long. Like when I first started 2.5 years ago, I was being told BPC 157, nothing can possibly go wrong. It's the perfect peptide. There are no side effects. Yeah. 2.5 years and 10,000 people later, I can tell you that for some people, it can be not the right thing right at this minute.
Right. So what,
sorry.
No, you're fine. What started you down this path? Like you gave your background and your studies, but what was like a catalyst? Was there a health thing for you, or has this always been like a career choice for you?
No, I mean, yes. I mean, I started off in this sort of. So when I was in college, I studied human physiology.
Okay.
And, but then when I went to work and I was a fitness instructor, which I kept the fitness instructor thing going my whole life. I think that was my way of keeping my hand in kind of in health and science, which was my first love and remains my love. But I then in my career fell into, of all things, magazine advertising. And so I was a sales rep. I was an ad sales rep. I became an event planner. Like I did all these different things.
Yeah.
And until one, and I mean, I had a great time. I made a lot of money. Life was really fun. But, you know, this interest in health and this belief in the human body's ability to heal was always with me. And I think that some of the things that brought me back to this was that, number one, I would look around me and I could see in my family, people developing a lot of these chronic preventable diseases. So things like type 2 diabetes, things like cognitive issues, things like arthritis, you know, all, if I have a big family, so you name it, you'll find it somewhere. Although the type 2 diabetes is rampant, the high blood pressure is rampant, like all of these things are really, they're highlights, right? And I, you know, like I just kept thinking like, it doesn't have to be that way. There's got to be a way. And I've always really believed that the body is the most powerful healing tool that on the planet. We just keep getting in the way.
Yeah.
Not net. And I remember when I was studying anatomy and physiology and all this stuff in school, I remember walking out of one lecture in particular and turning to the person next to me and saying, so basically what we learned today is that we don't actually know. You know, for everything we do know,
yeah,
there's a, we don't know how many things we don't know. Like if you look at mitochondria, for example,
right.
Like everybody's running around talking about mitochondria and they're so amazing and they are truly jaw-droppingly amazing. We know about this much about mitochondria.
Right.
And there's a lot we don't know. So
yeah, and it's like, you know, yeah. I grew up in the IT field and I always heard the term, the more you learn, the less you know. Because it's like every time you peel back the onion, you're like,
there's something
more
else
depth to it than you realized it was even there.
Exactly. And so for me, what I think is so incredible is if we can tap into these compounds and these systems that help the body to do what it does so that we just kind of get out of the way, what more elegant solution is there than that, right? Like I just saw a thing online yesterday. I think it was on Instagram, and it was a doctor's post, and he was holding a heart in his hand, but this heart was like snow white. And what they'd done with this heart, they'd removed all that he was holding was the protein, the pure protein infrastructure of the heart or scaffolding of the heart. And what they were getting ready to do, or what, I don't know if they have done it yet, or they were thinking about doing it, is basically taking, this was a donor heart, but taking the recipient's stem cells and blood and reinfusing it into this heart so that it now becomes of that person. So that now you can bring a new heart into a person's body that the body recognizes as its own. Yeah,
because that's one of the biggest things is organ rejection, right?
Exactly. So I think that the most elegant solutions out there right now are these things that are looking to tap into what's existing in the human body, and how can we re-energize it, bring it back online, reintroduce it, trigger it. You know, what can we do to light that spark again so that it starts up?
It's kind of work with it rather than
then try to somehow arrogantly try to do something for the body, right? So,
Right.
I go back to like a blood pressure medication that seeks to bring down blood pressure. Well, you've done nothing to address the reasons why that blood pressure is
Right.
going up in the first place. So you're in this constant war with Mother Nature. And guess what? She always wins. She's like fighting with a toddler. They don't actually believe that they can lose.
Right.
So they are always the ones that win. So that's kind of the, and so then moving through the whole area of peptides. So you've got these healing peptides like this BPC 157. There's a whole sector of immune peptides that are peptide proteins that would be produced, or fragments of proteins that would be produced by the thymus gland. And we know that as we age, our thymus gland involutes. It no longer functions the way it used to. And so these are compounds that, when reintroduced back into the body, kind of get those things going again.
Okay.
There's another area in peptides called growth hormone secretagogues. And these are fragments of proteins that signal the brain to produce and release growth hormone.
And how is that? Why is that beneficial? As in like regenerating the brain?
So no, they are not regenerating the brain. They are signaling that they are giving the hypothalamus the poke. Hey, we need growth hormone. Hypothalamus is now going to signal the pituitary gland, like it's going to make the growth hormone, and the pituitary gland is going to release it. It's going to hopefully suppress somatostatin. Growth hormone's pretty complex how it works in the human body. Historically, what people have done who have had what they perceived as growth hormone deficiency, or for example, bodybuilders typically would try to boost their growth hormone. They would basically just go for exogenous growth hormone.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
The challenge with taking exogenous growth hormone is, number one, your system now, there's all these negative feedback loops in the body because the body knows that too much is no good.
Sure.
So you now shut down your own production. So even though you're able to overwhelm the system and provide more growth hormone than is physiologically appropriate, so you're going to get those signals to build bigger muscles and the whole 9 yards. The bad news is that you're getting rid of the checks and balances already in the body, and you're shutting down your body's own production of it.
Yeah.
With these growth hormone secretagogues, what you're essentially doing is you're giving the signal to the brain to make more growth hormone.
Okay.
To restart making growth hormone. And why would you want to do that? So to begin with, as we age, we make less growth hormone. So at 50 years old, you're making 30% less growth hormone than you were when you were younger. By the time you're 70, that's gone down to, I think, 70%.
Wow, that's a significant drop.
That's a huge drop.
Yeah.
And so what does growth hormone do for us? Well, growth hormone helps us to heal. It helps us to build muscles. It helps us to, growth hormone will brown white fat.
Okay.
So we know that as we age, all of these things start to slide. So when we might use growth hormone secretagogues, or where you'll see them used clinically from the doctors who are using them, is when they have a patient, for example, who's had an injury. And so let's say they're using BPC 157 and thymosin beta 4 to heal the injury. Well, they may also use a growth hormone secretagogue, because during that time of healing, you want to upregulate the release of growth hormone.
Okay.
And the cool thing is that BPC 157, one of the other things that it does is that it sensitizes growth hormone receptors, so that now you're making more of the growth hormone, and the receptors are, let's say, more receptive to that growth hormone.
So they're willing to like receive more of it at a higher quality, maybe.
Or maybe they'll bind better, or whatever the case may be. So, this is a class of peptides that I wouldn't use willy-nilly, and you want to be cautious with it. If people use too much, they can have water retention, they can get joint pain, like all of those signs and symptoms of excessive growth hormone. Sure. You could drive insulin resistance, which is a bit of a paradox, because when people use growth hormone secretagogues, typically when they're used appropriately, they'll notice better sleep, better recovery, better skin. Like all of these, they'll lose weight, right? Because it increases, it upregulates lipolysis. Sorry, not speaking English properly today. So there are growth hormone receptors in adipose tissue. So it helps with the breakdown of fat. So people will often find they've lost weight.
Right.
Plus, if you're recovering better from your workouts, you're going to work out harder. So and you've got more growth hormone on board. So you're building more muscles. So,
and then you're doing it naturally too. Through the working out, you're producing the human.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So going back to the part where like artificially driving it up too much can shut the system down naturally, which would then, to me, be like a double reverse. Like if you stop doing that, it would be even worse, like a deep backslide.
Exactly.
So I thought I heard, I might be misquoting or didn't quite catch it, but I've also heard, and I think it goes down to the right portion or the dosage of things. There's too much, too little, and then there's that sweet spot. But even with like human growth hormone, there can be too much, and it can be negative from an anti-aging longevity perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, growth hormone in and of itself it's kind of aging, right?
Yeah.
Because it's driving anabolism. So anabolism ultimately is essentially aging. So the trick is hitting that sweet spot. And I would call that the holy grail. I mean, everybody's always arguing you can't measure growth hormone that well because it's always going up and down. People will use IGF-1 as an analog. That's kind of a very imperfect kind of way to measure growth hormone. For a lot of people, they think it's the best that they have. So it's, again, like, I think you have to be, for people who might use it just for healing an injury, let's say, it would be great. But if for people who are really going to use it ongoingly or who have any kind of health issue, you've got to be working with a practitioner, ideally a doctor who can help you. And anybody with a history of cancer, you've got to be working with someone who is going to help you to, first of all, understand what the risks are and help you to monitor what your response is and what your levels are so that you don't get yourself back into hot water.
Right. So how, bioregulators was the other term you mentioned. How does that fit into this conversation?
So bioregulators is a whole other class of peptides.
Okay.
So the peptides we've been talking about are, they're up to 50 amino acids. Like I said before, some of them might be even a little longer than that. The bioregulators is an area that was developed by a professor in Russia called, his name is Vladimir Kavinsin. And the bioregulators are a series of peptides that are no more than 4 amino acids long. So these are 2 to 4 amino acid chains, and they are specific to tissues, glands, and organs in the body. What they do is, because they are so tiny, is they cross the nuclear membrane and they are able to bind to DNA, get that DNA strand to open up and start to upregulate the production of proteins. So in a very simplistic way, what the bioregulators are able to do is initiate rejuvenation of a tissue, gland, and organ from within. And so Professor Kavinsin will speak to a biological reserve that we all have, that humans have in every tissue, gland, and organ. And what these bioregulators are doing is tapping into that biological reserve.
Okay.
So this is work that's been ongoing in Russia now for over 40 years. So these are not new.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They're, shockingly, they weren't running around publishing articles in the New York Times because,
the great news source of information for medicine, right? New York Times. So is it because it just took this long to figure them out? Because you hear numbers like that. It's been studied for 40 years, heard other conversations like that, but it's never been released or rarely released. Is that just part of the science process of some things that, through discovery, it just takes a certain amount of time for certain things to find the value of what it is? Does that make sense? Like kind of like the shiny object syndrome, like that's just science, is chasing the rabbit a little bit and digging into it and see where it goes. And then you realize the application. I
think that there's a bunch of reasons why this hasn't hit. First of all, there's no pharmaceutical company that's behind it. he's done a fair number of human trials. He has a whole institute in St. Petersburg, Russia, where they use these bioregulators. There's a number actually of institutes in the States that are doing studies on bioregulators, because the real nut of bioregulators, if you will, is, if you can imagine, reversal of disease and reversal of biological age. And so there's one bioregulator, for example, which is possibly the best known in our world, if you will, is one called Epitalon or Epitalon. So Epitalon, and that is the pineal bioregulator. So this bioregulator targets the pineal gland.
Mm-hmm.
It normalizes melatonin production, which you can only imagine the downstream effects of normalizing melatonin production.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, it activates telomerase. So it actually lengthens telomeres.
And
beyond that.
And
yeah.
telomeres, just real quick, can you define that?
Yeah. So telomeres are the ends on, they're like these, if you imagine your DNA strands, you have two strands, and imagine there's two shoelace endings on the end of the telomeres. Every time that DNA replicates, because that's what our DNA does, it doubles and doubles and doubles. You lose a little chunk, like you lose a Lego block off the end of the telomere. When the telomere gets to a certain shortness, right, your DNA can no longer replicate. It can no longer keep doing what it does.
Okay.
So if we can lengthen the telomeres, the logic is then we should be able to have more life in the DNA, and we're able to repair for longer. So, the woman who discovered telomeres got a Nobel Prize for it. But I think it was not right around then was the time when Kevinson discovered that Epitalon lengthens telomeres.
Okay. So would it be safe to say that telomeres is kind of our own biological clock ticking? And when you get to that certain point, the candle gets only so far and it's not going to burn anymore.
Yeah, you run out of wick, right? The only thing is that people are endlessly arguing about, are telomeres that important to longevity? A lot of people are like, well, poo-poo telomeres, but the reality is that if your telomeres are itty bitty, you're just not going to be able to go much longer, right? So is it a chicken or the egg thing? We don't really know. I think there's, all these areas are so novel in the scientific world, and there's so much squabbling about it that eventually I'm sure somebody will come out on top.
Yeah.
But the truth is that you're better off with longer telomeres than shorter telomeres. And this compound seems to be able to lengthen telomeres. Okay. It also has anti-tumor effects. It also has receptors in other places in the body. So on the thymus gland, so in the heart. So it's really interesting that, when I first started reading up about bioregulators, I was like, oh, the pineal bioregulator is specific to pineal gland. There's another one for the thymus gland. There's one for the heart. There's one for cartilage. There's one for muscle. There's bone marrow.
So it's that prescriptive. It can, it's going straight to that.
So they're super specific. However, as I kept going in the readings and learnings, is that the cartilage bioregulator, which are like, oh, cool, I'll just pound cartilage bioregulator and, it'll be great for my cartilage.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. What Cartilax does is it upregulates the production of collagen and elastin. Well, collagen and elastin happen to be super important for the heart and for the kidneys and for all these other organs. They need to be pliable. They need that stretch, right? It's kind of like your stretchy clothes. You need the stretch. And so there are receptors for Cartilax, or the cartilage bioregulator, in many different areas. And reading further, there's evidence, and the Russians have done a lot of this work. And I don't know how much of it is really available to us, but if you go on PubMed, you will find a shocking number of articles about bioregulators. And you will see that what they're talking about, and we almost never use a bioregulator by itself. We almost always will use bioregulators in stacks.
Okay.
Because they work synergistically together.
Okay.
Right. There's a passage in one of the books that I was reading where they describe how Epitalon will bind to this DNA. It'll get the strand to unfold, which will kind of expose a binding site for cartilage, for the cartilage bioregulator, so that it will bind. And now you get this upregulation of the production of those proteins, which is super elegant, right? I'm imagining it as kind of like a movie, right? But it's, and I would imagine that there are many of these synergistic effects that we don't even know about yet.
Sure. Yeah. It always seems to be, I mean, even some of the other pharmaceuticals is over the last 2 years that they're seeing certain drugs that were used for one thing have had positive benefits to completely different things that seem completely disparate, but apparently maybe not.
Exactly.
Or they have compounds that can also help here and there.
Absolutely, for sure. And then because they've got we can call them pleiotropic effects, or that one effect that it has in this one place also benefits something else. I think is it Cialis or Viagra or one of them that also has they're studying it for cognitive effects, because if it's a vasodilator, well, if it's going to dilate the blood vessels in the brain to someone who's suffering from restricted blood flow, this might be a benefit. Right.
And I mean, even what we're talking about, so much of it has to do with blood flow and getting the right amount to it for healing purposes. There was a question I was going to ask about. Now I just lost my train of thought on it. But on the organ aspect of it, so you can be really specific. So would that be, slight personal question, not slight, but around the lungs and asthma? Can that help from that perspective? And I'm not trying to be a doctor.
No, yeah, potentially, right? Because if there's been damage to the lung tissue and you have a compound that can help to the lungs to regenerate, then potentially it should help. I don't know. And I haven't, I have seen in the group people get pretty amazing benefits from bioregulators. It takes time.
Sure.
Right. If you think about what you're trying to do here, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in 2 weeks. It's not not like taking a supplement for energy and waking up the next morning with more energy, for example. It's just not going to happen that fast. And again, you have to prepare the terrain. You have to have addressed inflammation in the body. You have to have addressed any exterior sources that are preventing the body from doing what it needs to do, and provide the nutrients. And so for me, if I have someone who's got a musculoskeletal injury, for example, even whether I'm using bioregulators, which would be a longer play, or peptides, I'm going to make sure they're using essential amino acids. I'm going to make sure they're having bone broth. I'm going to make sure that they're getting the nutrients that they need also. Like building blocks, not just the signal to do the work.
Right. So that makes me think of something that I've had conversations on too, is we're talking about doing the optimal thing. And I guess this goes to personalization, but how frustrated folks out there listening, I've tried this, that, and the other, and I still feel terrible.
Yeah.
Where you can be doing the right thing and not getting the right result. Are there underlying reasons related?
I almost always, right? Whether it's chronic inflammation, whether it's a heavy metal toxicity issue, whether it's a mold issue, like exposure to mold. Some people we know genetically are much more susceptible to mold than other people, or Lyme, for example. Some people's bodies don't deal with Lyme the same as others. Some people clear heavy metals better than other people. Some people clear toxins better. So if you have, and this kind of leads us back to the epigenetic and genetic camp, where if you have these predispositions and you're able to say, and those predispositions don't mean you have the issue, but if you have those predispositions, you have an issue, it behooves you to say, oh, wait a minute, I'm not really good at clearing whatever it may be. I've had this exposure. So now I better do some further testing to find out, is this the thing that's standing in the way? Because if you've got heavy metal issues, I would guess that you can take all the bioregulators you want. They're only going to take you so far.
Sure.
They're just, and the other thing I'd like to say, the other thing I want to say about Apeiron before we go also is it's the other thing that it does that is so, it's so transformative. Like if you push me up against the wall and said, okay, you get one bioregulator, that's the only one you get. You got to pick one. And I'll be like, yeah, I can't do that, but I can. And it would be Apeiron, because what it does is it resets a circadian clock, both your circadian clock and systemically, the whole body systemic clock. It is referred to as a master endocrine regulator.
It's like
because
the clock reset.
Exactly. And so the downstream effects are going to be pretty amazing, right?
Okay.
This is one of the things that I heard about in that first lecture that just kind of, Kavinson did some studies on elderly people, and he showed that just using Apeiron and Thymogen, which is the thymus bioregulator, he was able to reduce all-cause mortality massively.
Wow.
Like massively. And then when he added in the blood vessel bioregulator, so those would be the three, right? You would imagine a three-legged stool: blood vessel, pineal gland, and thymus gland. So you've addressed the delivery of nutrients and removal of toxins at a cellular level. You've addressed immunity, and then you've addressed this whole master clock. Again, like he was able to show in human studies and in 75 to 85-year-olds as well, like a reduction in all-cause mortality that is jaw-dropping. In animal studies where they exposed rats to 24/7 light, which would induce tumors in these Wistar rats that are prone to tumors at the best of times, like a reduction in the incidence of tumors that, again, is
wow. No kidding.
So, yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, how do you sign up?
Yeah. Where do I sign up? I know that's
can I be a test?
So there are people in, I'm part of a clinical trial right now with a doctor in the US who works with Professor Kavinson.
Okay.
And I'm using about 9 bioregulators a month. Now, I'd been playing with bioregulators previously to this and doing all the other biohacking things that us people do. So my starting point on my biological age was pretty good.
Okay.
So I'm curious to see how much it's going to improve kind of moving forward.
Yeah. It'll be interesting. So you mentioned a couple different organs. You mentioned the brain at one point. I'm curious about that as somebody who, basis of this was epic burnout, overtraining, under-recovered, and cognitive challenges. Started out as a joke, but it's not really funny, is I can't remember my 30s because of the sleep deprivation with kids and all that stuff. And there's just, so it's improving, but there's still that gap. So how or where does this fit in with brain health? Because I see too in some of the headlines with the rise in cognitive issues around Alzheimer's and dementia. So are these areas that can be supported and helped as well?
Possibly. There are peptides that are very specific to the brain. There's a lot of work that still needs to happen in that area.
Sure.
But you get compounds like cerebrolysin, which is, it's actually a complex of peptides that are extracted from pigs' brains. You get compounds like Cmax and C-Lank, that these are peptides that are very specific for the brain. BPC-157, thymosin beta-4 have a lot of benefits for neurological health. And then you get the bioregulators. You have the pineal bioregulator. You also have another one called cortexin, which is the central nervous system, more overall brain health bioregulator. And then, with Alzheimer's and dementia, we can't not talk about things like like cerebral blood flow. We can't not talk about things like insulin resistance, which at least in some of the cases is implicated as well. So anything we can do to address those same, horsemen, the chronic inflammation, the blood sugar sensitivity or insulin sensitivity, however we want to put it,
right?
Appropriate and good blood flow. I mean, one of the other areas I recently dove into, again, because of, I'm like you, we get a guest on, and next thing you know, we're lost to everybody for the next 3 weeks because we've fallen into yet another rabbit hole. Like, what happened to them? And that's nitric oxide, which I knew nitric oxide. We know nitric oxide is important, but you spend enough time talking to this one woman. Her name is Beth Shirley.
Okay.
And happy to introduce you to her. And she works for a company called Berkeley Life Professional. Well, she's one of their scientific advisors. And the next thing you know, you've got everybody, you know, including your parents, taking nitric oxide support because it's that foundational. So to answer your question about the brain, it's all of these things and more.
Okay.
Right. But in the world of peptides and bioregulators, there's definitely compounds that I think can at the very least be helpful or be parts of the pieces of the puzzle that can help to optimize people.
Okay. All right. So men and women are different genetically, biologically. So I want to talk a little bit about that and kind of lead into something you have going on in the collaboration in the coming weeks and months. So how does this relate to men and women differently, or does it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I would say that with the peptides and the peptide bioregulators, now there's a bioregulator for the prostate gland and another one for testes, and there's one for ovaries. Okay. So there's specificity there already. I think from what I can tell, they are low enough, or they're high enough, or in the hierarchy, maybe they're low enough in the hierarchy that they're going to benefit both genders appropriately. You don't have to worry about it as much.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense at all.
Well, I guess there's enough common ground that common ground will impact the differences.
Well, it's because it's enabling the system.
Mm-hmm.
And so the system is inherently different in men and women. All you're doing is flipping the switch on that system. So it's gonna initiate, let's say, differently in a woman than a man. It doesn't, the place where we're initiating the activity, if you will, doesn't concern itself with what happens downstream. Yeah. That's built into the system already.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way I look at it. Right. And definitely we know that there are massive differences between men and women, and, definitely more so, much more so as in women's reproductive age. And once women are postmenopausal, we're still very different, but the gap starts to narrow a little bit because hormonally, even though we're still distinct from men, there's less of that schism. And as a matter of fact, we start to see some of the diseases that afflict men more start to rise up more in women as our hormone starts to shift. Right, so, right. And we are different and need different attention, if you will. So,
yeah, sure.
What you were alluding to is a good friend of both of ours, actually the reason why we're talking here, the person who brought us together, Dasha Maximov, who's the founder of WealthCo, approached me last year. We met a couple of years ago, and actually funny circumstances in an online summit where both of us were on a panel with one other person, but there was only the three of us and they didn't have a moderator. So Dasha ended up moderating the panel of three with three. So, but it was the start of a beautiful friendship. So I'm eternally grateful to those guys. But her big thing is women's health. And so she approached me and said, Nat, would you be interested in hosting a retreat with me for women? And because my thing is longevity, would you be interested in hosting a longevity retreat for women? And we would fold in resilience, which is really her banner, if you will. And so that's what we've done. We've created a retreat that will happen at the end of March. And it's a 5-day intensive. We're limiting it to only 11 women because we're going to keep it small and intimate, because in as much as, we have 11 women with us for 5 days, we're also personalizing it because every one of these women we're going to run their genetics, we're going to run their biological age tests, and then we're going to spend those 5 days digging and helping them to understand how this, as a woman and where they are right now, personalizes them and moves them into the next several months journey and beyond, really.
Yeah. That's awesome. I love it. We hadn't mentioned this. I mean, I'm married, but I also have 3 daughters. I'm an older brother of 2 sisters. So, and had the opportunity to have Dasha on last year, and learning so much about kind of the gap, not kind of the gap in medical science that isn't as personalized for women as it really ought to be. So I think it's wonderful you're doing that. It makes sense to go deeper and wider for the individuals attending to really understand, because I mean, at the end of the day, regardless of what it is, the application is the key. We can learn all day. We can chase rabbits. I love chasing rabbits. You affirmed the few habits that I have, but it's about applying it into our lives and integrating it into it.
That's a huge piece of it. And even also curating this. I mean, there's so much information out there, right? So being able to filter through that information and understand what's relevant to me right now, and understanding that what's relevant to me right now may evolve and change over the years.
Sure.
And that's
especially for women, to your point.
Oh, well, I mean, listen, a woman is a researcher's worst nightmare, right?
That might explain the medical science history with things, because of the variability.
Well, I mean, even in a woman in her reproductive years is 4 different people in a month, and that those hormone shifts are going to have a massive impact on how her body interacts with any number of things, or responds, if you will. So, it's you kind of get why they still steer away from using women sometimes in medical trials. And yet these are really important questions to answer.
Yeah. Maybe I'm guessing, I'm not a scientist or anything, but I guess the study, but it would be cool to kind of take the same cohort and do month over month with the same person at a different week.
Yeah.
To understand even that individual. I don't know the testing, but I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud as a non-science person.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and sometimes as a non-science person, you have a different perspective. You can kind of step back, and certainly the scientist is going to look at you and have no idea what you're talking about. But at the end of the day, what you do know is what, on a common sense level, right? What it's not is maybe practical from a financial perspective.
Right.
And that's where they kind of get crossed up. But,
sure.
But as Dasha loves to say, women are not small men. I don't know who came up with that first, but they're not. And we need to kind of get our arms around that and our heads around that, and just go with it.
And I'm grateful for that too. So, I really appreciate your perspective and all that you're doing. It's fascinating to me. All this medical science, like you said, the rabbit holes just keep. I mean, I guess that's part of the fun, is you're constantly finding something new. But what's maybe 1 or 2 things for those listening to distill it down and make sense of it? Is it trying to do the research yourself, or finding a coach like yourself or a doctor? What is that next best action for those listening?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it depends, right? So if you're one of those people that really likes to do stuff yourself, you got to get no matter what, you have to get some perspective. And it also depends where you are in your health journey. If you've got a lot of complex things going on, you're going to need some help. We all need a coach. We need someone from the outside to help to give us some perspective. And so depending on what it is that you've got going on, you may need to find a functional medicine doctor. You may need to find a doctor who's versed in these areas, who can really help you out. If you are looking to optimize and you're fairly literate yourself, and you've got a couple of things going on or whatnot, you may do fine finding the right health coach and someone who has spent the time digging into the material, who basically can help to give you that perspective and maybe curate some of this stuff for you, so that you're not chasing down all these different leads and trying to figure out what applies to you and what doesn't. So I think it just depends on the type of individual. Most people I know don't have the time to become literate themselves in order to be able to apply this stuff. But I can tell you that in this group of 10,000 people on Facebook, like I am amazed at what people take on for themselves.
Yeah.
And you know, many of them have been disappointed and let down by the conventional medical system, and they've had no choice. Like they've kind of, they're the people they've realized that they're the only people that's going to be able to, and it's not necessarily that they always solve their problems themselves, but they're on a quest to find who's the person who's got the knowledge that they need to unlock the key to what they've got going on for themselves. And unfortunately, that often means that they end up kissing a lot of frogs before they get to their prince. Like
well, and you know, I honor those folks because a lot of people don't take their own personal health by the reins and drive it. And it kind of goes to the, you know, what you were saying about even what I was saying on, you know, I'm not a medical scientist, so I don't, but I'm better than a novice of myself. And certain things that, you know, I've used and don't feel right, or they could be good, but it doesn't mean it's good for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And recognizing that is the single most important thing that people have to understand. It's like BPC 157, like we said earlier, it's by and large a really beneficial compound. And yet there's still a portion of people, a subset of people that it doesn't work for, or it's not right for, or their body's not ready for it. Or look, I can't use growth hormone secretagogues. Like I'm wildly allergic to them. Go figure. My immune system decided, yeah, no, you're not getting that. I'm like, come on. Like,
come on, man.
Actually, you know what? The people who are listening to this may remember at the beginning that we said we were going to save this new peptide that I think is going to revolutionize obesity and type 2 diabetes. And we haven't spoken its name yet.
Oh, so that's a fair point.
As we're about to wrap up, maybe we should tell them what it is. And it is something that for the most part, you would have to access this through your medical doctor. It would be better for you if you had insurance because it's incredibly expensive. But what it is it's a class of peptides called a GLP-1 agonist. Now, GLP-1 is something that we make in our body, but it's very short-lived compound. It lasts about 20 seconds. What the pharmaceutical company has done is they've taken this GLP-1 and they've extended its lifespan so that this is applied as a subcutaneous injection once a week. The end result, and I'll just summarize very quickly for people, is that it improves dramatically your body's response to carbohydrates by upregulating the release of insulin by the pancreas. Improves blood sugar disposal, so glucose disposal into the cell. So your body is better able to put glucose away into the cell. It has benefits for cardiovascular health. It has benefits for cholesterol. It has cognitive benefits. It's being studied right now specifically for certain neurodegenerative diseases. And it helps people to lose weight.
Wow.
So it solves two big problems, type 2 diabetes and fat loss.
That sounds
rather dramatically.
Yeah, that's huge. And a cascading effect too.
And it's doing it like a peptide. It's doing it by getting the body to do what it does better. It also upregulates your metabolism. So for people like me, you know, I've kind of been toying around with it just to see what it's like, who monitor our heart rate variability. Your HRV is going to tank because your resting heart rate goes up. Right? Because what it's done is it's turned up the heat on the furnace. So the heart's working a little bit harder. It's beating more times per minute. Your aura, who's been used to, like in my case, my resting heart rate at night was in the 40s. Now, all of a sudden I'm in the mid 50s and it's like, whoa, dude, whatever it is you're doing, bad. Like, stop. I'm like, no, actually, I think I'm doing all right. This is good. So it has some black box warnings. It's not a get out of jail free card.
Sure.
It's not the kind of thing you want to just toss at your body. Anybody with a history of thyroid cancer probably wouldn't use this because in the research on lab animals, they noticed a small uptick in a very specific type of thyroid cancer. It's medullary thyroid cancer. It's possible that that's because there's more GLP-1 receptors on rat thyroids than there are in humans, but nobody really knows for sure. In some, again, a small percentage of people, it can cause pancreatitis. Is this because maybe the pancreas was already stressed? Now you're forcing it to work and it can't handle it. Or it also slows gastric emptying. It decreases it increases satiety dramatically. So you just fundamentally, you don't eat as much.
Wow.
So, you've got like this incredible list of things going on. You've increased your metabolic rate. You're not eating as much, but your burn rate is higher. Your response to carbohydrates is better. You're putting away the blood sugar more efficiently. Like all of these amazing things are happening all at the same time.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So you see, so I do think that this compound, and there's a few different GLP-1 agonists. So semaglutide, which is a brand name drug called Ozempic, which people with certain conditions can get covered by their insurance, and that's the way to go. But there's also another one called Trulicity, which I think is diraglutide, and then there's liraglutide. So there's a few different GLP-1 agonists. But I think that, the big one is Ozempic.
Gotcha. Natalie, thank you so much. Before I close out, we're a little bit over, but
Sorry.
I
just felt people would be upset if we didn't get to that. So.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I want to be respectful of your time. I close things out with a couple of personal questions, nothing too heavy, but what are you reading right now?
Oh God, I'm reading a book to prep for a podcast called Supercharge Your Health with PEMF Therapy.
Yes.
So I'm deep diving into PMF. I actually bought my parents not quite a PMF mat, but a PMI mat recently that I think has transformed their health, but that's for another day.
Yeah, familiar with it. I have a Beamer.
Nice.
So what are you listening to right now, be it music or podcast?
So music, I listen to the amazing playlist that my husband puts together that, I was saying to him the other day, I spent 3 hours sitting on the couch on Saturday because I couldn't peel myself away from the music. It was so great. But podcast wise, like I'm actually working my way through an epic episode that Peter Attia just put out on COVID-19, where he sits and chats with two other medical doctors.
Okay. I saw that come out. I hadn't listened to it yet.
It'll make you angry. It'll make you happy. It'll make you sad. But it's so informative. It's such a great, what I love is the lack of polarization. It's just a balanced discussion about what the heck's been going on and, how politics has gotten into this and made a mess of things. But anyway, it's a really good
out. I will check that one out.
It's a really good episode.
I'll be sure to include that in the show notes though, too. What is your go-to rest and recovery method?
Good question. I'm a really good sleeper, and I think it's sleep, maybe red light.
Okay.
I've got a red light device that I really, really love. And breath work. Like if I ever find that I think I'm too wound up to go to sleep, I'm always amazed at how effective a box breath or a 6, 7, 8 breath can just, like, I don't remember it. I practice my breath work, and then the next thing I know, I'm waking up in the morning. So, but I'm fortunate that way. I think I don't want to be flippant about it. I know that sleep for many people is challenging.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Natalie, for your insights and expertise. And I'll be sure to include the information for the wellness weekend or retreat that you have going on at the end of March.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. It was a pleasure chatting with you today. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for having me.
Take care.